occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic, both the public health and economic crises that have flowed from the pandemic and the extraordinary hardships that has meant for so many of our citizens and will continue to as this unfolds, as well as more recently, the pain and the frustrations and the unrest and in some cases the violence that's befallen some of our cities following the killing of George Floyd at the hands of members of the Minneapolis Police Department. And I expect all of the above is weighing heavily on each of us as we have this conversation, and this broader context, these several crises roiling our nation are not irrelevant really to how we think about our future, what our place is, and how we can make a positive difference. I trust everybody on this call and in this meeting hungers in some way to be part of making things better somehow, some way. That's what attracts us to organizations like Convergence and many of the other things so many of you do. And well, as I said before, we're just so eager for your thoughts on what role we might play, but particularly in light of these extreme challenges. It does feel to me that the work we do and what we represent has never been more important. I've said that to myself. Many of us have many times along the years we've been part of the Convergence family. I say it again now, and I mean it again now. And I think the real question for us is, you know, what can we and should we be doing beyond what we're planning, et cetera, to kind of bring that promise to life, but particularly in light of these extreme challenges we all face. With that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Doozy to just walk us through some of the Zoom housekeeping so that we can hopefully have that glitchless experience that we all hope for, and then we'll take it from there. So Doozy, over to you for instruction for the rest of us.
Thank you, Jean. Welcome. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm Doozy Casada, the Director of Development and Finance here at Convergence. And so I'm going to just share a few brief Zoom tips for today. First, if you would please turn on your video, we would like to be able to see you. At the same time, please turn off your microphone unless you are speaking. Both of those controls may be found at the bottom left of your screen where it says mute or unmute or stop or start video. We also want to encourage you to engage with us as much as possible, so we encourage you to use the chat. I see that many of you are already practicing, which is great. If you haven't already, please say hello and let us know where you're zooming in from in the chat box. Throughout the meeting, if you would like to speak, please, we would ask if you would use the raise hand feature. This can be a little hard to find. So what you do is you click on the icon that says participants at the bottom of your screen. A sidebar will pop on up on your right-hand side, and you will see there a little blue icon that says raise hand. If you have trouble finding it, please feel free to ask. You also have multiple ways of viewing the meeting today, and that's entirely at your discretion, but we want you to know what's available. So in the top right-hand side of your screen, you can toggle between speaker view, which is where the person who is speaking takes up most of the screen, and gallery view, which shows you all of the participants Brady Bunch style. If you like gallery view, because you like to see all the faces, but you also want to make sure that you don't lose, for example, David Eisner, CEO, because he will be leading us and facilitating us throughout most of the meeting, you can take your, you can click on the video, on his video, and there's 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner, and you can choose pin video so you don't lose him. And if I lost you, we did send out a Zoom guide in advance of this meeting, which has also been shared in the chat, and I'll ask us to share it again so you can look at that. And also, we're here to help. So if you have any technical difficulties, we recommend you chat or email my colleague, Lee Hilford, who can provide tech support. With that, Rob, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Doozy. And I also want to welcome everybody. I will be brief as well. I understand that someone else has succeeded me in the main job, and I need to make sure there's time for that person. I want to especially welcome people here for the first time. I hope you have a great experience, despite the fact we're not in person. And again, I have a deep appreciation, want to express a deep appreciation for so many of you who've been with us for a long time. helping us move the mission forward. I've always loved these leadership council meetings and believe they've been central to not only building our network, but deepening our work. We get great advice from all of you, we get involvement, we get connections, we get funding. You help us build a broader network for ourselves and make us much more effective. And I want to say, at least from my experience, the fact that all of us gather and all of you are so supportive of the work gives the staff a spring in their step to feel like there are others with us, walking the walk with us and helping to try to make a difference. So it's really great that you show up and you continue to be ambassadors for the organization. Like Jean, I want to acknowledge a special moment we're in the country. As heartbroken and angered and frustrated as all of us are by events of recent weeks, like Jean, I would say the pathway out of this lies with deep human connection and communication. We're truly understanding the stories and motivations of all the players who can be part of the solutions to the problems we have now. We have an opportunity now to go deeper with all of us open and vulnerable with each other. We need to make sure we do not define people entirely by their professions or their jobs or what groups they're part of from left to right. And I'm not suggesting there's moral equivalence across all the groups, nor that everyone that's involved in all the disputes and problems we have now will necessarily engage constructively, but we do have a chance now to get underneath those conflicts and clashes, to find areas of our shared humanity and the shared purposes that we have in common. I wonder that I'm going to quote our board member, Linda Laurel, who has a podcast I wholly recommend to everybody called Our Voices Matter. And Linda posted something recently that came from an interview she did last fall with a former white supremacist, Shannon Foley Martinez. And Linda made the case for why we should do what we're doing to reach out to people of all different walks of life and backgrounds, even people for whom we have distaste. And she said, we all want the same things. We want to be loved. We all want a better life. We all want connection. And we all want to feel like we belong. And so I would suggest we make that as a start, that assumption that's true for all of us as a starting point, and give people the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. Finally, the main reason I was asked to say a few words is to speak about this special time of transition within Convergence. And let me start by acknowledging the talent and dedication and resourcefulness of the Convergence staff. They have performed so admirably and effectively as a group for so long, and they've really risen to the occasion now as we pivot and adjust to new realities. I am very grateful to all of them to have had them as colleagues for so long, and I know David shares my admiration for the staff. And in terms of the transition to the new CEO, I'm sure you all would agree with me that the immediate past CEO had done such a marvelous job that almost anybody could have succeeded him and been successful. By April 1st of this year, polarization in the country had all but disappeared. Convergence's main problem in terms of finances was just figuring out what to do with all the money that people were throwing at us. And by now we had prepared the entire country to be resilient and collaborative in dealing with the multiple challenges that everyone else has laid out with the pandemic, the economic collapse, and events of recent weeks. So virtually anybody could have done this job, but of course, I'm kidding. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a critical moment for the country and for Convergence. The challenges are daunting. I want to tell you how terrific it is to have David Eisner at the helm. What he's accomplished in 2 short months is quite breathtaking, and you're going to hear a lot about it today, and I hope you will find it as remarkable as I do. He is bringing new energy, creativity, and ideas to our work just when we need it. And personally, I'm so pleased to still have an opportunity to contribute to the important work as we go through this transition. It's truly going well, and it bodes well for Convergence. And with all of your advice and your continued involvement, I believe we can maximize the contribution we all can make to a more functional, civil, and loving society. So with that, let me turn it over to David Eisner, our new CEO.
Thanks so much, Rob. I love the opportunity to thank you not only for building something so important and effective, but also I just so much appreciate your generosity and helpfulness to me. It is so great to see everybody here and to know how much the Leadership Council has contributed to the thought and operations and position of Convergence over the past decade. I've been here now 2 months. It's hard to express how honored I am to lead the organization and this critical mission, especially at this particular moment. And I know that I echo the sentiments of Jean and Rob in terms of what this moment means. For me, even as shaken as I am in these days with anger and grief and anxiety from the murder of George Floyd and from the protests and unrest it's unleashed, I am also greatly appreciating the unprecedented way that this killing has proven to offer common ground across meaningful differences. I've been taking a lot of solace in reading the perspectives of many leaders who bring different perspectives. And just want to quickly point to 2 leaders in recent days that I've worked with in the past, George W. Bush and Congressman John Lewis. Bush, while expressing shock and outrage and grief over the killing, he emphasized for white America this urgent need to listen over his emphasis of the reaction of defensiveness for law and order. Meanwhile, Congressman John Lewis, a leader who marched next to Martin Luther King, he also expressed his anger and grief. He put it into the historical context connected with his own history and experience. And he used that experience to emphasize for the community of protesters the critical need to maintain a strategy of nonviolence. And this kind of common ways of coming together has been expressed by many more people. There's something unique and powerful about the way we're experiencing this time together. And I appreciate not only these leaders coming together, but finding opportunities to ask others to come together, which of course, bringing people together across differences to find solutions is what we value at Convergence. So let me just spend a second walking through what we're gonna do on today's meeting. In just a minute, we're gonna have what we call an icebreaker that will move us from our individual experiences where we're sheltering at home into this collective work and into our community with each other. Then we're gonna have a section where we're gonna review Convergence's current strategy and hear from a couple of leaders from our board, and hopefully find some time to engage among the larger group on strategic questions. Then we'll have an opportunity to dive into 2 new programs that Convergence is launching. We'll be engaging in discussions with you about some ways that those programs will be important, some ways that they're going to be different than you may have experienced Convergence programs in the past. We're going to have an opportunity to speak to the folks that are leading, and we're going to engage with a couple of past stakeholders from dialogues who will be able to talk with us about what we're expecting from, or what we may be expecting from these dialogues. Then we'll have, at the heart of our discussion, we'll be able to turn to you and hopefully have a very rich discussion about your perspectives on Convergence's best role and best opportunities in this moment. So until we get there, keep this question in mind. How should Convergence step up and lead in this moment? And then after we hopefully answer that question to our satisfaction, we'll draw to a close. We'll be making a couple of asks of you. So that's the sequence: icebreaker, strategy discussion, program discussion, engagement on our acting in this moment, and conclusion. Does that sound good? So let's jump into the icebreaker. Because we want this virtual leadership council meeting to have all of the best qualities of an in-person meeting, we're going to start with this opportunity to have a chance to meet with some other people in the room. Zoom is going to notify you shortly that you've been assigned to a breakout room. When you get that notification, please click the button that says join at the bottom of that notification. Then when you find yourself in the breakout room with a handful of other participants, please introduce yourselves and then answer this question. What is your mindset now as you join our conversation today? Hopefully you'll have a chance to be with this same group later on in the program. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Again, introduce yourselves and answer the question, what is your mindset as you join our discussion today? Thanks to everyone for joining in. I heard in my focus group how much all of us are affected by the concurrent crises that we're dealing with, and also heard so much how much hope there is, especially for the role that convergence can play. All of us appreciate everyone's willingness to dive right in and to be transparent and even vulnerable within these groups. So I hope everyone feels ready to dive into the work of convergence, where we're going to take off right now. So this is the part where I'm going to share some remarks about our strategy. I hope all of you have received and had a chance to read the documents that we shared over email that provides an overview of some of the strategic pieces we're developing here at Convergence. And I want to start a discussion of developing strategies and new strategy elements by noting as clearly as I can that developing or making something new does not in any way constitute any kind of change in our mission, in our core values, or in the essence of what convergence does or stands for. We have and we do and we will always address intractable issues by bringing together diverse stakeholders, building trust across differences, finding those opportunities to build, to find common ground, and then finding innovative solutions to those intractable issues that our society can benefit from implementing. And what's a little bit, the pieces that are a little bit different in how we're responding to this moment is we've got some really deep challenges and interesting challenges to address. We have a staff that's sheltering in place. We have the loss of our ability to bring people together, which is so much at the heart of how Convergence has done our work and how we've been impactful. As everybody knows, there's new challenges around fundraising that are part of what's happening now. And there's also new difficulties in terms of breaking through public awareness and the awareness of a lot of stakeholders that really matter if convergence is going to make a difference. And we're experiencing tunnel vision in the media and among public and private sector leaders. That tunnel vision is probably entirely appropriate. And yet that tunnel vision is also a challenge as we try to get attention for the work we're doing. Now, at the same time, we're also recognizing some interesting facts. This is in many ways the moment for which convergence was created. There is attendant to the crises before last week, and then this new set of crises that have been added this week, a new urgency to rise above the dysfunction and to find common ground and to find solutions. And that urgency is growing in waves that are extremely supportive of what Convergence stands for. And even as the oncoming election is forcing dynamics toward polarization, we're also seeing many leaders very intent on recognizing that this is a moment that's above political polarization, and we're seeing more leaders than ever trying to find their own pathways to bridge differences and find solutions. So we're seeing the American public, American elected, appointed officials, corporate and nonprofit leaders and institutions, all looking very intently, and in some cases desperately, for exactly what Convergence has to offer. So I would say that through the end of April, we saw this response to this moment as primarily building through what we call the detour strategy. The idea was that we were going to find new pathways to get through a very defined set of crises and then rejoin back to everything that we had been planning to do up until then. And today, I think we understand that the changes in our environment are a bit more fundamental. This crisis, the set of crises, as well as the aftermath, is going to last far, far longer than we had originally internalized. And we know that America is going to look different as we emerge from this environment. We expect now that America is going to have a sustained and different level of need for many elements of our work. And we also expect that the difficulty in bringing groups of people together in person from multiple geographic locations, that difficulty is also going to be present for a lot longer than we'd originally anticipated. So, and finally, the urgency of the need to respond to critically powerful and urgent circumstances for vulnerable populations, that need, that urgency is also, unfortunately, going to last much longer than we'd originally anticipated. So with that, looking at the environment that way, with that said, I want to turn to the sector, the marketplace in which we see Convergence operating. Thankfully, what's happening is that there's a field of colleague organizations connected with this kind of work that's beginning to mature. And that's partly in response to the more recent acceleration of toxic polarization and problem-solving dysfunction that we've seen. And it's also partly in response to how many of you and people like you are agitating for those kinds of organizations. And we see Convergence occupying a space that intersects with three interlocking areas of that work: addressing polarization, building trust, and focusing on democracy building. So look, bridge building, democracy building, and issue solving. On the bridge building side, that's basically building bridges, bringing people together, addressing polarization, building trust, and increasing empathy and understanding. That's bridge building. Under issue solving, we see organizations focusing on identifying practical solutions to difficult issues, offering analysis and review of proposals, generating and supporting proposals in multiple sectors, and building support and momentum in coalitions, and ultimately building pathways forward for adoption of these proposals. And then the third area is democracy strengthening. And those organizations are building trust in our institutions. They're fixing our national and state-based and local abilities to be productive, fixing our politics, trying to build coherence around our senses of patriotism, and addressing structural issues that are driving the strongest voices to the extremes. So any organization that focuses on one of those issues, bridge building, issue solving, or democracy strengthening, is also going to touch on the others. But Convergence is really powerful and unique in how firmly our feet are planted in each of those three fields, and how effectively we work across those three fields to and create reinforcing cycles so that bridging differences, solving solutions, and strengthening democracy each happen in a stronger way because of the way we focus on the others. So as you've seen in the materials provided, given this, we've set some benchmarks for ourselves in light of the current crisis, and in light of the potential demand for our work and our current position in our marketplace. Over the next 18 months, we've shared a plan to prioritize accomplishing 3 goals. We want to launch 5 dialogues on solving problems that are necessary for America to have a healthy recovery from these crises. We want to generate sufficient dollars, we're counting it as 5.5 million, to cover our costs, not only for 2021, but for 2022 as well. And we want to establish and reach new targets for our brand awareness as an organization and for the perception of our organization. And we don't have those targets in place, but we'll be building them. We've also laid out some innovations that we really want to build in place in our work and that we want to test. And we think that these are innovations that are going to significantly contribute to our ability to meet those goals of launching 5 dialogues, generating sufficient dollars, and reaching these brand awareness and perception goals. And those 3 innovations, first, we're going to be reconstituting some of our past dialogues to accomplish results more quickly, to leverage the trust that already exists among these stakeholders and their past experience. And also, it's a great opportunity to demonstrate that long-term relationships can continue to bring value when we grow trust. So reconstituting past dialogues. The second innovation is focusing on delivering interim results of value along the path of each dialogue. And we think that these interim results, as opposed to only having one report at the end of each dialogue, we think that these interim results can extend our impact, can increase awareness of the work, can attract more funding, and at a operational level, they'll basically be lowering the individual cost of each deliverable. And we don't think that these are going to be consensus, the same kind, the incremental deliverables or results are not going to be the kind of coherent consensus recommendations that we see often at the end of these dialogues. There might be sharing a single proposal or share lists of the groups from the group on the obstacles they're facing, or name the places where the group sees a certain kind of potential for moving forward. They might even review, look, here's a really important area where disagreement lies and where we're, as a group, going to have to put energy. Basically sharing results in real time that help others understand what's happening in the issue, build awareness, and improve impact. And then finally, and necessarily, a big change that we're going to make is we intend to conduct very high quality dialogues in an online environment. This is an area where we're going to have to learn fast, learn from people that are excellent. You're experiencing our very first endeavor in that regard. I'm going to summarize where we think this is going to get us. We hope that all of this work will increase the recognition of our work and sense of relevance at this moment. We hope that it will increase our financial capacity so that we can focus on getting more work done and focus our capacity on expanding our growth and scaling into the future. We're hoping we'll have dialogues that have increased impacts and be able to execute them in shorter amounts of time. And we're looking to build leadership among a growing field of organizations that are together helping America build bridges and solve problems and make our democracy stronger and more effective at addressing our common needs. Of course, all of this work is done in very deep partnership with our board. We have a board meeting tomorrow, and we have most of our board members here on this call. And I just want to introduce two board members that I hope many of you already know. You can make sure to check out their impressive bios that you've received in the briefing packet. Cherie Harder is the president of the Trinity Forum, and Lindsay Tirico is Director of Policy and Advocacy at United Way Worldwide. And both Cherie and Lindsay volunteered to share some reflections and perceptions from their perspective around where convergence is at this moment. So maybe Cherie and Lindsay, first of all, thank you for being willing to do this. And Cherie, would you like to go first?
Happy to. Thanks, David, and thanks for inviting me to say a few words. I know it's been quite the whirlwind for you, taking the helm of Convergence. I recall that your first day on the job was April Fool's Day, and so you stepped into a pandemic, a quarantine, a growing economic dislocation, and since then we've moved from 2 crises to 3. But I just want to tell you how much appreciate your resolve, your creativity, the energy that you brought to the role amidst a lot of kind of volatility and confusion. So just really want to thank you for that, and excited about some of the proposals that we'll talk about, and also excited about just the energy that we've seen behind some new fundraising efforts. I know you've already had over $1 million worth of solicitations go out in 25 different institutions, and that's all really exciting to see. This has sort of been said before, but it is amazing that just in just a few months, we've gone from essentially, well, what seemed like relative calm serenity to 3 huge crises. We're in the midst of a pandemic, which isolates and separates us, a recession and economic dislocation that strains and depletes us, and civil unrest that inflames and scares us and leaves us in a place where we are vulnerable. We're fearful. We see a lot of our resources being depleted. It is basically a civic bedrock for real distrust, dislocation, and increasing division. And so I am so proud to be part of Convergence. And I think one of the most important things that Convergence does is really provide a trellis on which the vine of civic engagement and collaboration can grow. It's very hard to do that on a significant scale without institutional support. And Convergence, I think, does an extraordinary job of providing that support. The 2 different green-lighted issue areas I, as a board member, am just very excited about. I think it is a very smart and just tactically sophisticated approach to look at the whole issue of gun violence through a lens and a focus on gun safety and suicide prevention. I mean, the first kind of word that struck me, with a bad pun perhaps, is it's a disarming way to go about it. It invites in people to the table who might not otherwise be willing to go there. And it is, by any measure, a huge issue. most gun violence is suicide, and it's presumably something that no matter what one's opinion on gun control is very interested in addressing and preventing. It's also an approach, I think, that lends itself to different kind of people at the table and to different steps that can be taken and even sort of tested in different communities across the country. Speaking personally, I hope that in many ways, both the demand side as well as the supply side will be addressed. There are a lot of movies and programs that are essentially 2-hour-long commercials for the misuse of guns. And I think this kind of framing allows for new kinds of conversations to happen among a new group of participants. And I just think it's very smart. I'm also really pleased by the fact that Convergence is going to tackle economic recovery for America's workers. It's hard to think of something that is both more urgent and more important over the long term. So there is both a desperate and acute need. I also think this is one of those issues that lends itself very much to what David was talking about earlier in terms of lending itself to delivering short-term interim results on the way to bigger breakthroughs. I also think it's really exciting because this is something that we can have a lot of experimentation going on, both in different states, because of course every state is going to be very interested in encouraging and restarting the economic development in their state, but also within different sectors and indeed within different industries that have been particularly hard hit. So I think there's just real opportunity there for a lot of experimentation, a lot of different short-term, smaller results that can be replicated in other areas. And lends itself to exactly the kind of both short-term results with the potential for long-term breakthroughs that we've been talking about. So those are just a few thoughts, David. More to be said, of course, but as a board member, I'm really excited about these two green-lighted projects.
Thanks, Cherie. I'd like to turn to Lindsay and also let folks know that after Lindsay speaks, we'll have a short period of time for questions and thoughts. So if you want to raise your hand per Doozy's instruction, which means Doozy clicking on participants at the bottom and then clicking on the hand raise in blue. So Lindsay.
Hi, David. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share my perspective on where we're going and where we are as an organization right now. I think Cherie really captured many of the challenges that we're facing as a nation, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I think it's clear that our communities are hurting. But I do have tremendous confidence in David's leadership and the approach that he's taking. As you heard from his comments, it's clear that he's taking a very thoughtful and very strategic approach to this work. And most importantly, he's leading with listening. But he also recognizes that listening isn't enough, that we have to listen and we also have to act simultaneously. So he's doing a really phenomenal job of sort of balancing both of those things, coming in, listening to staff, listening to the board, but at the same time, being ready to quickly respond and move forward with these projects. I think from where I sit, the convergence work is more important than ever. The strategy to pivot from the response to the recovery is the right path for convergence. I believe as states are reopening and businesses are adapting to our new reality, we need leaders, we need organizations to step up and to give us a vision for the future. And I think convergence is unparalleled in its power to convene partners and providers and resources to address the needs of communities in crisis. And that work is more important now than ever. We know that convergence can bring leaders together. Now it will be more through virtual environments, but to rebuild and to reimagine more equitable, stronger, and more resilient communities. And I think it's important that, Convergence leads its work around not just going back to normal. We know that normal wasn't working for millions of people, and old and broken systems aren't going to fix our current challenges. We need innovative thinking. We need strong collaboration between private, public, nonprofit sectors to drive real change and to build more equitable and resilient communities. There's actually a really great piece on a blog called the National Equity Project that I want to just quickly read. And it says, if we are to learn any lessons from the most extraordinary disturbance in recent history, we must pause and consider this. In our rush to be in a more familiar state, to get back to normal, exactly which part of normal are we prepared to return to? Normal is code for status quo. Normal has never been neutral, objective, or fair. Language of going back to normal and new normal are dangerous propositions for all of us. So I think, particularly given the challenges that we're facing around civil unrest, police brutality, and all of these, and the inequities that have sort of come to light with the COVID-19 crisis, going back to normal is not where we should strive, but I think Convergence can think through and identify what that new vision should look like. And I think moving forward with these new projects, I think they are the right projects to focus on, but I hope that we will learn how best to integrate and frame these issues around equity and justice. I think not only because racism and bigotry and unrest is front and center for many of us, but because of, these are issues that are at the core of creating strong, healthy, and resilient communities. So whether it's the issue of gun violence or economic recovery, we know that those are already loaded conversations, but I would challenge David and all of us to think about how do we keep equity front and center for each of those projects. On gun violence, can we also talk about issues of police brutality and police reform? When we talk about economic recovery, can we also talk about economic justice and how we can create a more inclusive economic system where everyone has access to jobs and skill building and education and fair wages and housing? So that would be my challenge for all of us, is to think about how do we weave in equity framing throughout all of our projects. But I think the direction that we're moving in is the right direction, and have a lot of excitement and confidence and hope in where we're going.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. I appreciate it. I hope folks all appreciate how lucky I am to work with such a terrific board and with Cherie and Lindsay. Would love to hear from anyone your thoughts and questions. In particular, are there things about what we've been discussing that you find particularly promising? Promising elements of the strategy, and are there areas where you would provide cautions, pieces of what you hear us, where you hear us moving, that you'd want to flag something for us? Roxy.
Hi David.
Hi.
Hi everyone. I really appreciate what Cherie and Lindsay were just talking about, and I want to echo what Lindsay just said around the equity question. It's never been more important than now. It's always been important, and it's never been more important than now to take what's happening today and weave it into our projects. So I just want to say that, Lindsay, thank you for bringing that up. The second thing I want to say is I think these are two excellent projects. I've been wanting Convergence to work on gun violence for 10 years, so I'm very happy to hear that. So that's my personal soapbox. And I think the idea of going at it from safety and suicide prevention is certainly innovative and creative and has a lot of potential. And the last thing I want to say is that there's been some discussion in our group over time about you mentioned scaling, David. So one of the questions is, and maybe not the most burning question, but one of the questions is how can scaling convergence actually help fund convergence? So that's it. That's just a question that I think we ought to keep in our hats somewhere. And I'm just really so excited to be here. Okay.
Thanks so much, Roxy. I'm looking to see if anyone else is raising a hand. And until that happens, I'll also note, Roxy, we're thinking of the same thing. How do you create a virtuous cycle between scaling and fundraising? And one of the potential areas is to think of capacity. The more content we have, the more product we have to be able to put out there for people to support. Simon, I see you've raised your hand.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the interim report aspect. Can you say more about what that would be? Or can you take an existing project and give an example? What would be in the interim report and how would that be used?
Thanks. I think it's really important to focus on this. And the idea is not to do interim report. One of the biggest challenges that all of our stakeholders have is that the report at the end takes a huge lift because trying to build the kind of consensus to do an actual report that everybody signs on to and agrees with, that's a really powerful, difficult thing to do. And the question that we're exploring is, are there other kinds of interim products that the groups have to do anyhow? So we know that groups, for example, take an issue and they'll look across the issue at what the potential areas that the group might address would be. And they begin to think through which ones might be easier to build consensus on, which ones will take a lot more time to build consensus on. All by itself, sharing that kind of information might be a very, very useful thing for folks to be able to consider. There's also certain moments inside dialogues where different people say, oh my gosh, you and I are on the same page about this. That's amazing. We never would have thought about that. Well, what if there was an opportunity then for them to do a quick op-ed that talks about how much it can move a dialogue forward when people realize something about being on the same page. So it's really thinking about whether there's ways to capture natural points of progress in the dialogue and to think about using those points of progress to include people outside of the stakeholder group in that progress and to think about those as products. Simon, does that make some sense?
Yeah, and so the idea would be, first you said those are regular work products, not necessarily like some standard format interim report. And then my question would be, how would that be used? That would just go out as a general release, or you would be using it to try to invite other stakeholders, or?
Well, I think that really depends. One of the rules that we'd sort of have to set is any interim product, we'd have to be very clear about exactly what our audience was and how we were thinking that it might ultimately help with the impact of the program, and not just do it for the sake of doing it. Stuart, I see that you raised your hand. I appreciate that. Thank you. Stuart, you're on mute.
Hold on. Am I okay now?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. As you know, I'm very keen on this idea of looking for opportunities as a project develops over time, and we've seen it to some degree with some existing projects in the past. But I think it's really important. I would just make a couple of points. One is that I think anything which comes out in an interim basis clearly has to be a broadly based, has broadly based support for it. it can be really easy to get a small segment of a group we have together, all happen to have the same philosophy, for example, to come out and say something. That's kind of the easy thing to do, but it's really not going to be productive in the long term. I think it's more absolutely looking at these incremental steps or aspects of a bigger problem where there's an unusual alliance behind it. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think it also could be helpful in keeping a larger group focused and feeling a sense of being a team as certain things come out along the way. You know, I've been involved in various working groups, for example, on different issues over the years. And if there's a supply of products that come out, it keeps the group more focused over time rather than sort of, you know, wait till the very end and the big bang will come, you know. I think it can be helpful in that way. So I do think there's a small danger, as I said, that sometimes picking an easy issue to have some product could mean that it's a little bit lopsided, but I think that's easily dealt with. And as I said, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of build in this way. It does mean that you know, one of the aspects of some of our projects in the past, which is to have the group being pretty, you know, under the radar, if you like, and private in that sense. Wouldn't be so easy to do that if you're doing products along the way. So again, I think as people come to the table, they've got to be open to saying that before we get the big agreement we're all striving for, we're prepared to be known to be part of a group that's producing other things as well on the way.
Thanks, Stuart. And I think that's going to be we're going to have a lot more opportunity as we go to have discussion. I do want to respond to it by noting I probably should have listed that as one of the changes we're making. We do need to find ways that are appropriate to help people understand the importance of what we're doing and to shine more light on the role that Convergence plays in making these dialogues successful. And of course, we need to do it in a way that's not seen by our stakeholders as us using them for our purposes. And it has to be done in a way that's that is not overly self-promotional, but that's clearly about making sure that as we're doing the work, we're building a platform to get more work done. So let's switch. And I actually think it's a natural progression because we've been jumping into discussion, and I keep having to prevent myself from getting too far in front of a discussion about the projects themselves. So we're going to shift from a discussion of strategy at a high level to a more in-depth discussion of new products that we're launching. You read and heard that one relates to firearms, one relates to American workers in this moment. You'll note that there's innovations from the model that are playing out in both of these. And what I'd like to introduce Russell, who's a senior director at Convergence, who's actually moving forward with both of those new dialogues. Following Russell, we'll hear from Vicky, who's who's a director of projects and our West Coast leader, managing work in California, who'll talk a little bit about how we're closing out the California Health Initiative, and also about how we're looking at another dialogue that's not yet ripe, but that's really interesting. And I'll introduce, once we hear from them, two other stakeholders who will share some of their perspective and join Russell and Vicky in a discussion of programs. So Russell, why don't you walk through each of the dialogues that you've been directing.
Great to be with everybody, friends old and new today, and excited to keep learning together, building on the conversation we've heard already. As I think folks are sensing, even in the discussion today, this is going to be a fluid and evolving situation. And so if we're trying to construct a project that's reacting to a fast-moving, incredibly complicated crisis, the way we react to it will have to be fast-moving and nimble as well. So you're going to hear some of our thinking on it today. I'm going to thank you in advance for listening with a spirit of generosity as we do at Convergence. I'm going to give you a very thin top line of what is obviously quite a nuanced set of two issues. So I'm going to invite you to look at what you were sent in writing as well and engage with us going forward with your own ideas and the conversation, recognizing you're going to hear a little sliver of what's in the mix today. I also want to briefly thank Omar El-Khatib and Erica Loken. As you all know, we have a really small staff that does this complicated work, the work of building relationships and trust. And I want to thank both of them in working closely with me on a range of issues, even though I'm the one talking to you today. We also know that a lot of the issues playing out in the background, the economic collapse resulting from the pandemic and what is not at all new, but the fresh unrest in the country that connects up to unequal access of opportunity and systemic racial discrimination. We know that is impacting not only the country and the communities within it, but also the individual people, the stakeholders we convene. So I just want to name that we're asking people to come together in a virtual setting to have incredibly hard conversations while they themselves are holding in their own life a number of complex issues. And so we just want to name that the work we do is already difficult. When we're meeting in person, it's even more difficult now. And I think we're going to be navigating that in the weeks and months ahead. So to quickly describe the two projects that we're very excited are moving forward, we've got more learning to do on each front, but we have some initial traction that we're excited about. The first one, as I think you all know, is a partial reconstitution of the stakeholder table that I led that wrapped up its work a couple of years ago called Working Up. That project was aimed at increasing upward economic mobility, especially for low and moderate income workers and their families. And it uniquely brought together employers and worker advocates and many other perspectives to really round out a classic convergent stakeholder table, and came up with a bunch of good ideas. So we believe there's a way to pull some of that work forward and build on it, and to possibly add new pieces. As you've seen in the written materials and in the discussion so far today, we've begun kind of branding this renewed effort, economic recovery for America's workers. We think there's a way both to target some actions around the emergency we're facing, and also to help inform the rebuilding effort going forward, and to make certain that it centers the equity we heard so much about from Lindsay and others earlier. I think that's going to be critically important as young adults, communities of color, and others, people who are facing long-term unemployment, face especially high barriers to economic opportunity. That was true well into the recovery we all enjoyed after the Great Recession, and obviously the devastation now is many, many times worse than that. We think what can be unique about this project is that we can pull back together part of the stakeholder group we already worked with, add some new voices to the mix that might have targeted issue expertise. And the goal of this, as David already alluded to, would not really be starting with a blank sheet of paper and thinking about from whole cloth what a set of solutions might be, where we have to come to agreement down to every comma and a long list of recommendations. That does not feel incredibly feasible in the moment where we have to move quickly. We're probably going to be meeting for shorter sessions that are virtual in nature. And so there's a range of creative ways we think that the group can vet good ideas, can lift up and pull forward the good work we already did together, where we can influence the debate that's going on in the administration and Congress and elsewhere. There's important work being done by our business partners, which is why this group will again have a critical component of corporate leaders, small business perspectives, as well as larger employers, being really important to think about our workforce challenges and how we reconnect people to jobs. So again, this space will be unique in that it will be cross-sector and cross-partisan, which we think is a really great value add. There's a lot of good ideas about how to rebuild for folks economically right now, but they are largely coming from spaces where folks are in a particular sector or ideological corner. We think this is a space where we can have some generative work that has a cross-sector and a cross-partisan nature. We've gotten an early vote of confidence in this work by having one of the really core funders of the prior project, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, agree to come back in and to provide some support and to also help us reach to other funders, which, as you've heard from David, there's already been a lot of work on that done. We believe the work of this group will both inform the public policy conversation and inform the range of actions that can be taken beyond what Congress and other elected officials will do. That'll include work at the state and local level. Again, our focus is not necessarily a whole new set of consensus recommendations from scratch, but all of the ways we can influence the conversation. That might be public-facing communications like op-eds. There was some discussion just now on the call about other sort of interim deliverables. There's also a range of ways the group can do quiet work behind the scenes to help each other move initiatives forward and share information. That might mean groups linking arms and nudging along a key member of the Senate or another important actor, even if they don't do any public-facing communication around it. And our dialogue space can be a place to work out those opportunities. So what might this look like as far as what are we actually talking about addressing? The issues bubbling to the top in our early efforts and in the conversation we've had so far with some of these important stakeholders include how do we reconnect people to jobs, and how do we do the important skilling work to match people to available employment, given that we now have over 40 million unemployed people, some of whom will likely reconnect quickly to the job they had before if their industry or sector bounces back quickly, but we know many of whom, including the employers who used to employ them, face a very long period of disruption and dislocation. We know some sectors of the economy will likely not bounce back in the same way at all, or that it will take an incredibly long time for that to happen. So rehiring and reskilling efforts will be a really important area of focus. Another one we've identified that will likely be a focus area that the group did a lot of work on the last time around was childcare. I don't think I need to explain to anybody on the call why that's a really big part of economic recovery, but it's really been underlined. Access to quality, affordable childcare was incredibly difficult for many Americans, especially those with low and moderate income jobs, before the pandemic and the economic crisis. We know right now that sector is being eviscerated, and that it will be almost impossible for the economy to fully reopen and function if many workers don't have access to childcare that's safe and of a high quality. And so we think there's a lot of work we can do around that issue that again would include solutions coming from our private sector partners, as well as how we can influence actors inside government. Thirdly, there's a whole range of strategies that would increase the financial stability and security of low and moderate income workers, including things like the earned income tax credit and other levers of change that would financially stabilize people creatively through public policy and through private action at the national and the state and local level. So that is a quick preview of some of the issues that are emerging as a framework for that economic recovery project. Lastly, I want to say that the stakeholders we assemble are going to be really important. So we're really giving a lot of thought to the entree that they have to levers of change. We want to make sure the group is obviously diverse in the ways Convergence always does, but we want to especially make sure that people most impacted have a voice in this process. There's a lot of ways to do that by who sits at the virtual table, who we consult, the research that we look at, the speakers we bring in. There's a bunch of creative ways we're going to make sure that those facing inequity in our country are a part of crafting solutions, and that we really look hard at whether the solutions we've crafted, in fact, knock down those barriers to opportunity. The second project that we're moving forward on that I have the pleasure and the challenge of getting to lead, which is such an important issue that I know many of you have asked us to tackle for a long time, is a conversation connected to guns in America. We all know that the current debate on this issue is really stuck. Folks are talking past each other, and there's very little mutual understanding. We've been doing a very careful assessment over the last several months, where we've spoken to over 100 people. We've had individual in-depth interview conversations with over 100 people. We've convened a couple of small group discussions, one of which was conducted virtually over Zoom, entirely with a group of gun rights advocates to help inform our thinking. And what we've learned is we think that tackling the entire gamut of issues connected to guns does not make sense. It's too broad and unwieldy. And frankly, we're going to have to find tractable ways to enter the conversation, especially when we're asking people to convene virtually for what will likely be shorter conversations that are a little different. There are some advantages to the technology that can democratize who can join. So we're going to make sure that we take full advantage and exploit those advantages. We also know there are some limitations. And so we've decided for a few reasons to pick this focused, targeted area. We're calling it a better conversation on guns. We're going to find some snappier names going forward, but really a targeted focus on two things. Number one, building deeper understanding in all directions, but especially building deeper understanding of gun ownership. Many Americans own firearms. Many Americans, around 40% of Americans, live in a household that owns a firearm. Whether you think that that's great or awful, or whether you're indifferent to it, that is the country that we live in. And so the only way Convergence can convene differently and better around this issue is to have some deeper mutual understanding that cuts in every possible direction, but that in particular begins by understanding the reasons why people own firearms, and there are many of them. We also are going to move away from an unhelpful dynamic that treats the two camps involved as monolithic. It just isn't true. It's not true that there's one camp that has a strong control, a strong mindset to reduce access to guns, and another camp wants completely unfettered access. There are broad and diverse perspectives across a range of views, and so we're going to convene differently and better by rounding out a stakeholder table that represents a broader range of those perspectives. So deeper understanding, especially of gun ownership, is one big goal. The second one is bringing down, preventing the number of firearm-involved suicides and other misuse that would connect with accidents and injuries and things like that that can result from when a firearm is stolen or is not safely stored. We think that there's a whole bunch of actions that can be taken on that front that would allow people who are very, very skeptical to talk about this issue to actually convene around a table with that as the focus area. So quickly, why? Those are the areas we've identified because the numbers take us there. About 40,000 Americans die with some connection to a firearm every year in the last few years. About 60%, more than 60% of those are suicides. The input of experts and people with lived experience has also led us. We've done a very careful assessment and talked to a bunch of people from every possible perspective to talk about their own connection to the issue. And this framing, while not uniformly affirmed, has been largely affirmed by the people across the spectrum that we should tackle it. Third, the way Convergence adds value, we believe we can convene, as I've said, different and better, where we may bridge to additional issues later. I want to hold out that hope, and I want to reassure you this is not the full range of issues we'll ever tackle, but it does give us a prescribed, tractable set of issues to tackle initially, and we believe that's where we can really add value as an organization, especially in this difficult all-virtual convening environment. And then lastly, we believe the moment calls for these focus areas because with increases in unemployment, social isolation, emotional despair, and economic devastation, tragically come increases in self-harm and in suicide. This is a factually documented thing. And so this focus area for the project actually would be specifically responsive, even though these issues far predate the current crisis, it would be specifically responsive to the tragedies and the increased stress that people are under right now, under the economic conditions, the pandemic, and now the growing unrest in the country. So we're hopeful we'll see where we go. We're going to be getting started with the formal convening soon. We're going to have probably one more conversation as a next step in the next month to refine this frame that will include public health and research experts, as well as those on various sides of the issue. We think there's a lot of value that we can add here. We also think this is a project that might have opportunities well before some sort of final consensus document is created to have impact and to have deliverables earlier than that, some of which would be public facing and some of which likely would not. But we're really hopeful about that. So that's where I'll stop with a quick overview of those two projects on the substance. David, thanks so much.
Thank you, Russell. It's really extraordinary work, and I'm so glad that we're able to sort of green light this great work you've done on the guns dialogue. Vicki, will you quickly hit the how we're closing out CHRI and the upcoming exploration, just as a tease?
Certainly, David. I'm happy to. First, I just want to say that it's truly heartening in this moment that all of you are here today to support our work. It's more important than ever, and it's really wind beneath our wings to see all of you. So I'm here with good news. A couple years ago, Convergence took a flyer on a project in California run by people who had not previously worked at Convergence with an eye towards seeing what we could build outside the Beltway. So we launched our California Health Reform Table with a shout out to Daniel Bowling, who's on this call, who helped us get that going. which comprised a diversity of key leaders who understood both policy and politics. They told us the timing was right to come together to address the cost of healthcare. It was spiraling up faster than income by far. And so because we had the right people in the room at the right time, our dialogue built trust in the room that successfully catalyzed a groundswell of support outside of our room for our recommendation of a new comprehensive approach to containing healthcare costs. And so in March, we released our report, and a big thank you to Don, who our project associate, who's on this call, that was instrumental in that, which I am delighted to show off for the first time at a Convergence meeting. I wish we were in person and I would hand one to each of you, but you can find it online and we may even be able to chat a link. So the groundswell catalyzed in our room led to both the governor and the legislature agreeing with this approach. The governor proposed an Office of Healthcare Affordability to enforce cost targets, and the legislature introduced bills to enact it. So given the success of Convergence's first state level project, per earlier when we talked about interim, about reconstituting dialogues, we will explore that with this group. Right now, they're obviously otherwise occupied with all of the public health crises going on, but at the right time, we will approach them on a follow-on dialogue, because this group bonded so well that one of them calls it our little think tank, which I just love. But in the meantime, we are exploring other issues from the West Coast. Perhaps it could be a national project this time, and our leading candidate to explore is privacy, which has obvious relationships to this coast and has received even more attention during this pandemic. A couple of years ago, Rob Hirsch and I did a salon on privacy out here, and there was an awful lot of preliminary interest, and we think there may be even more interest now. So we're going to take a hard look at that. And of course, we will intentionally, as Lindsay, our board member, suggested and reminded us, look at this issue through the lens of equity and pay intentional attention to the disparate impact on the basis of race.
Thanks so much, Vicki. I'm really excited to hear how things go with the privacy, to watch how things unfold with privacy as a potential issue. And you did some remarkable work with the California Health Reform Initiative. So I'd like to quickly invite Lanhee Chen, who's who is fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institute, and also director of domestic policy studies at Stanford, and who's participated in several Convergence dialogues. I'd like to invite Lanhee to participate in this next section, and along with inviting Mark Zitter to also participate. And Mark is chair of the Zedema Project and was also a partner and supporter in the California Health Reform Initiative. But before we do that, let's try something new. We're going to try to do a poll. And what we're going to do is ask a question that Doozy is hopefully going to tee up for us really quickly. And the Zoom poll says, stakeholders in a reconstituted dialogue who have experience working together will produce results on a new issue more easily and quickly. Please select on a 1 to 5 scale how much you disagree to agree. 1 is you strongly disagree with that statement. 5 is you strongly agree with that statement. Again, the statement is stakeholders in a reconstituted dialogue who have experience working together will produce results on a new issue more quickly and easily. And this is something that we're testing, so it'll be fun to get your response as your hypothesis, and we'll let you know how right you were. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds to respond. It looks like we've got 84% response, 87% response. Let's see if we can we broke 90. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. So now you can see the results. You'll see that 5% strongly disagreed, 5% were neutral, most people agreed, and second came in strongly agreed. Between agree and strongly agree, we were over 80% at 87%. So thanks to everybody. Now let's turn to Lonnie and Mark, asking them to answer their perspective of the question, but also to provide feedback on what you heard about the projects, about innovations that we're trying out, tests that we're trying out in the projects. Lonnie, from your experience working with so many dialogues, what are you expecting now, and what are you thinking will work, and where we have to pay careful attention?
Well, I was one of the poll recipients or poll respondents who said that I agreed, but not strongly so. You know, and I just want to maybe briefly say why that is. I think that there is a tremendous opportunity in both of the topics, particularly that Russell outlined, that I've been thinking about. And certainly I think having the stakeholders kind of reconstituted in that way is hugely helpful. I think one of the challenges in these sorts of things is getting people, and I know people who've participated will probably agree with this sentiment, it can be difficult to build trust initially. It can be difficult to sort of be in a position where you feel like you can completely be honest and candid in your observations and thoughts. And I think the benefit to having people around a table who know each other a little bit and who've been through it before together is that some of that groundwork doesn't have to be relitigated. And I think that's very valuable, particularly when you're talking about the kinds of topics that that you all are considering. So I'm of the belief, at least, that having some of that history that's shared is hugely impactful and hugely helpful. So, you know, that gives me optimism. I think one of the challenges, of course, in this is how do you bring in new voices? How do you decide who else to include? And I think that can be a challenge because on the one hand, you do need new voices. I mean, we're thinking about economic recovery post coronavirus. There are constituencies that you'll want around the table who weren't present for that first conversation who will be hugely, hugely helpful and hugely important. But how do you do that while at the same time maintaining the balance that you've already built and the trust that you've already built up between the existing stakeholders? I think that's one of the challenges that the group is going to have to deal with. But I don't think it's a feasible option to say that you're going to just keep things locked in time. And so that's certainly something that I think deserves some thought and deserves some careful approach. But overall, you know, the reason why I continue to participate in these is because I find the interactions to be valuable and the opportunity to sit down with people of differing perspectives and who sit in different places to be valuable as well. And so even if there's a situation where we're not able to come to agreement on a set of policy prescriptions or on a set of solutions, having made those connections and having those discussions, I think has been useful to me. So, you know, I'm optimistic, cautiously so, about the reconstituting of certainly around the economics piece, and, you know, delighted to continue participating.
Lonnie, before, so you alluded to even when you don't reach consensus. And you've told me that one of the, if not the most effective dialogue you've been in actually was one that didn't reach consensus,
Yeah.
which was the future of health. Can you be just a little bit more specific? Why would you say that a dialogue that didn't reach consensus was actually the most impactful?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how much background the group has, David. So I don't want to go into too much detail. But Stuart was there too, so he might have some other thoughts on kind of what happened. But many of you are aware that a group of us came together to discuss these national healthcare issues, which, as it turns out, healthcare is complicated. Who knew? And so we had a challenging set of conversations that involved pretty much all of the stakeholders that you can imagine needing to be around a table to talk about healthcare reform, from representatives of the provider community to the payer community to the innovation community to people seeking a more just and fair healthcare system. We had, pretty much everyone around the table. I don't think that we had a major constituency absent. And it was a very challenging set of conversations. I mean, just to be honest, I think some of the conversations were frankly quite frustrating because it felt like we were dealing with very kind of parochial interests at times. But that's kind of what the healthcare system is. It's the composition of the healthcare system is a bunch of interests that fundamentally think quite parochially, and that's why we haven't had broader reform. So the reason why I thought it was productive was twofold. First of all, just the chance to hear people verbalize what was on their minds, I think was useful. I think you get a sense for why the doctors think the way they do, or why the insurance companies are where they are. So I think that's helpful. And as I said, I think because we had built up a fair amount of trust, we were getting a pretty decent view of what people thought, warts and all, which I think was helpful. But the second piece, David, that I'll just mention is I think it's useful when you are able to build some of those connections, because what you find is that there are maybe specific issues where you can garner some mutual interest and support, and it continues after the dialogue. So I'll just give one example of that. There's a few of us that have been thinking about a way to boost health insurance coverage, or the number of Americans who have health insurance, by automatically enrolling those who are eligible for subsidies but not otherwise enrolled. There are a number of different reasons why our healthcare system makes it hard for people to actually get coverage. One of them, it turns out to be, is sort of institutional inertia. And so what if you did a little bit of jujitsu and turned that inertia on its head and made it easier for people who were eligible to get coverage to get into that coverage without having to do a whole lot? And so that's an issue that has some bipartisan interest, actually. And I've been known to be right of center. And so, for me, I think being able to carry some of the water from that side of the spectrum, along with some friends of mine who are from the other side of the spectrum, I think is useful. But what the dialogue, what our healthcare table was able to do was to kick off a conversation that is continuing actually to this very day. In fact, there's a group of us from that still get together by Zoom probably once every 10 days to 2 weeks or so to talk about, how can we advance the dialogue, particularly in light of what's happening with COVID and the huge decline in employer-sponsored health coverage, because people lose their jobs and they lose their coverage. So we're trying to figure out, is there a way to stick this concept into the next round of stimulus or the next round of activity legislatively? And that wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't all, kind of sat down and figured out that we had this common interest via the Convergence table. So that's why, David, I think it's useful, even though the group did not reach a positive conclusion in terms of the recommendations we would advocate for. I think there are pieces of it that still can be drawn out and worked on.
That's really terrific. Mark, coming from your experience with participating in dialogue and now seeing our focus on online, bringing all of this virtually, do you see opportunity here? Do you see challenges? Are there special things we should be looking out for? Because this is really an area you're an expert.
In terms of switching from, on in-person meetings to virtual, I've thought a lot about it. The Zedema project you mentioned that I chair is much like Convergence, and it brings together a variety of stakeholders. Lonnie is in that group, except we don't actually aim for conclusion, but we had to go to an all virtual model, obviously, as everyone else did. I told my staff, we're going to do this. How can we be best in the world at it? And I think that if you ask people today, you know, are online meetings as effective as in-person meetings? Most people would say no. But let's be fair, we've had millennia to try to get good at in-person meetings, and we're as good as we're going to get. And we're brand new at virtual meetings, and a lot of them are lousy. So it's not a fair comparison. But and ultimately, clearly they're different. They have different advantages and disadvantages. I would say that now, having done a lot of work in the last couple of months on virtual meetings, both professionally, extracurricularly, and personally, I'm running all kinds of meetings. I think that in many ways they are equally good, and in many ways they're better. So some of them are obvious, that some of the advantages. You get more attendance. You know, Zedema bumped up attendance 25 to 30% when we went to virtual meetings. We get better access to attendees who can't come to meetings, including some guests you may beam in just for a little bit of the meeting. Including some people who just don't want to travel, can't travel, won't do it for your meeting. We get people who can't attend a full meeting. You know, Lonnie's a pretty busy guy in the California Initiative in Sacramento. He had to drive an hour and a half each way, I assume, and he couldn't get to all the meetings. I have a hunch that if we had him beaming in for some of them, it would have been simpler to get pieces of that. So we're finding a lot of that too. We can have greater frequency, and that builds more connection over the same number of hours, I would argue. So if you had one 8-hour meeting in a month versus 4 weekly 2-hour meetings, same amount of content, I would argue you get to connect with people more, and actually you feel closer to them, and you build more trust with the same number of hours because of the frequency. Clearly lower cost, clearly lower time commitment because you're not wasting all that time traveling. So some obvious things. There's a bunch of less obvious ones that will only emerge more as we get better at these meetings. Okay? So much more interactions. You already look at the chat box we have in this meeting. In a lot of meetings, if you're one of 15 people in a meeting, you're on average getting 1/15 of the airtime, but not in a virtual meeting. When we asked people about where they were beaming in from, almost everybody was there. So you're getting people interacting and not just being passive recipients of what's going on in the meeting over time. Meeting management, as a meeting facilitator, I can tell you it gets easier when you can private message people, or people are private messaging me as the leader. There's different things we can do with that. The use of private chats, which we haven't done here, are interesting too, because if you're in a room in a meeting and you're talking to one another and two people have a side conversation, that's distracting, that's impolite. But here you can do it, and it can actually build additional connections without interrupting other people. You saw the breakout rooms. Vicki and I tried breakout rooms in our settings, and it was inconvenient because we were either in the same room in a big room and people were distracting each other, or you had to try to find some room somewhere else in the building. You saw how easy it is in a Zoom meeting. And then finally, well, not finally, but just the last one I'll mention is this polling you did has the advantage of not only getting information, but it's anonymous. And you can do a lot of real-time course correction. Think about this. What if in our upcoming virtual meetings for the projects that Russell's talking about, if we, in the middle of a meeting, we said, how much consensus do we have on this issue? And people could vote anonymously. What if once every meeting, or at the beginning and the end of every meeting, we say, what's the level of trust you have in the other people, right? And you could see that track over time or not track. We don't do that in in-person meetings. These are all the advantages that I think we will learn to take it to exploit with these meetings. So I don't know. I know there's advantages and disadvantages. I think that for Convergence, which is equally committed to trying to be best in class, I think this will net out at least as well and probably better. I think we will find ourselves more effective and more efficient dollars spent with the virtual setting.
Thanks, Mark. Mark, are there any other pieces of of how we were looking at doing the dialogues moving forward, especially in the areas of interim reporting or interim products and reconstituting meetings that you'd be interested in? Would it be a great idea to reconstitute CHRI, for example?
Well, I think that to the points we were talking about before about reconstituting, I think there's definitely a benefit to that in general. The poll did say, more easily and quickly, which are two words I don't usually associate with convergence processes, but I do think could be somewhat easier and quicker than certainly previously for the reasons that Lonnie and others have said. I do have the same concern about adding new people, but a little less so, because my sense is that it does take time to build trust, and that's partly a one-on, as an individual, how I relate to the group. But partly, I think if you go into a group that already has trust, you as the new person are likely to feel trustworthy and trusted and trusting of other people faster, because that's the culture of the group. So I think that in general, this is a good approach. In terms of CHRI, I think there's a lot to it, but maybe not quite immediately, given what's going on in California and most states with budget issues. And I think we'll have to wait till the dust settles a little bit more post-pandemic, and with some new budgets coming out, to see when the best time is to leap back in there. But we'll be able to do it very quickly whenever we feel the time is right. I feel pretty good about Vicky's being kind of tied into the people in Sacramento to get a sense when that time is right.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate that. All right, let's come back quickly to moving toward all of you being able to give us some advice. First, I really want to thank Lonnie and Mark, as well as Vicky and Russell, for that very quick, as Russell said, very, very top line discussion of where we're going on projects. And we'd like to get your counsel and open it up to your thoughts about how Convergence can be responding in this particular moment. How do we show up? How do we find ways to help the country heal in the face of multiple crises? Is there something that's missing from the way we're thinking about this? Should we be focusing on something else? How do we communicate the importance that all of us intuitively understand is Convergence's space right now? How do we communicate that to others? And to do that, we'll work in breakout groups. There will be a staff, these will be the same breakout groups that you were in the introduction. There will be a staff member supporting note-taking in a shared document. And there will be board members supporting facilitation. And here's the way to think about it. Look at the multiple crises: the pandemic, the economic collapse, the police-involved killings, the killing of George Floyd and other Black men and women, the anti-racism protests, the violence that we're seeing in cities. And think that what we've got is our social fabric is continuing to fray. Inequities that we've already spoken about are becoming more pronounced. Our ability to come together to solve our common challenges is deteriorating. And convergence has never been more needed. So the question to you is, how should Convergence step up to lead in this moment? Welcome back. I hope everybody got even a little bit of the insight that I feel like we uncovered in our group. It was really, really powerful. Does anyone want? Let's spend a few minutes hearing things that emerged. We don't have time to speak about to get a report back from each breakout group, but it'd be really terrific to hear short thoughts that emerged that you think you'd like to make sure the whole group quickly gets to hear.
David, I can jump in. Sorry, since I've gotten airtime before, but I thought we had a very productive session. The main thing we talked about, two things. One is that we don't think if we want to be leaders, we need to have followers, right? And if we want to step up for more leaders, we want to have more followers. And we don't want to assume that the way that we've always done the convergence process is the best way now that we're virtual, right? So Art even suggested perhaps we should have a whole redesigned thinking process. But in any case, let's not be constrained by the way we've done it in the past. And the second thing is we came with a specific example. So for instance, what if as we were starting a convergence process, of course, we interview people, get some experts, and then we put a small table, relatively small table together. What if we thought about it differently? What if the initial process was much, much larger? Was actually open to everybody in the public who wanted to talk about gun safety? And maybe we even partnered with CNBC or PBS and get a big forum there and get lots and lots and lots of input. Great. Then we might go through the traditional convergence process, but we have a lot more followers, people interested. The interim report, we reinvite them back. The final report, we reinvite them back. And now we've got more input, more connection, more followers, and we're more of a leader. So those are some of the things we were thinking about.
Thanks. Who else heard stuff that's as good as that? Ron.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you can hear me this time. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was having problems. I've never had this problem before on Zoom. Anyhow, one of the things based on my several experiences with Convergence that I think is useful and that I actually think is going to be helpful for Convergence's fundraising is that before a new initiative is started, I think it's very important to try to define what one is trying to achieve external to the people who are going to participate. Now, when I say this, I don't mean substantively, because that's an organic process. And, the group has got to gel. You're going to have people with different perspectives and points of view about issues. And that's going to be part of the ongoing process. But before that process begins, it would be very helpful, I think, to define what is it that we are trying to achieve externally. And so that everyone who's participating is buying into what they hope will be some kind of end result or product. Again, not substance, because people will have different views about substance. So does it mean, the light thing would be certain kinds of PR things like an op-ed. It might be a specific legislation. Again, that leaves room for the discussion about what should the substance be of that legislation. But I think it would be very helpful if the leaders of each initiative think through, at the end of the day, what do we want this process to achieve that is external to everybody who's participated in it? Obviously, the people who participate in it, trust will be built. There are other kinds of very beneficial things that occur. But I think that if we try to think about product, and it's not just a statement, it could be a variety of different things for each initiative. I think that's a useful thing. I think it's also useful in thinking about who needs to be in the room in order to achieve that.
Makes a lot of sense, Ron. Thank you. What else? I've spoken with so many of you, and you're not shy when you're talking one-on-one.
Faith Russell is raising her hand physically.
Oh, hi.
I couldn't find where my little hand thing was. I'm sorry. Hello, I'm Faith, and I think part of building on what has been said and what I shared with the group is, it sounds to me like the table has always been very limited, and you only had so many people around the table. And in my observations, I always knew there were other voices that should be at the table, and communities. And so much of the work of Convergence was sort of identifying an area, an issue, and almost pre-forming what it is we want to accomplish, and it went both ways. Some would be that way, and others, they would evolve into the solution. But it was so much, that initial table setting was so much based on relationships, and I know this person or this person, they don't agree, let's bring them to the table. those sort of things. And I think that that's always been my concern. And I think especially with the pandemic and with the issues going on in our country right now, it's less about the individual and more, I think, in my experience, about the institutions that we have that have really created so many inequities. And I know this firsthand, being from the Navajo Nation and what is happening now and what we're grappling with. And so I have always wanted to make sure that we gave equal opportunity. So the gentleman who just spoke and said, you know, this idea, I think it was Mark, you know, of virtually maybe we let everybody in. And I don't see why not. Because I think in that process, we will learn, because we think we know things. And by virtue of what we think we know, we don't know what we don't know. And so that has always been my nervousness about looking at issues, is I think we should be very open, very democratic, and really try to get as many voices in as possible, because we never know where that solution is going to derive from, or an issue we may never even thought of. And right now we need everyone at the table.
Our country just went through a massive cultural change over the past couple of years with the Me Too movement. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the Me Too movement basically changed the way we think about a whole bunch of gender issues. So we have new expectations, we have new standards, we have new values in a lot of areas, and we have a new normal on a lot of gender issues. That's really the right direction to go. And we have an opportunity right now with what we're having in racism, is for us as a country to face the fact that we have historically, traditionally been at one level an extremely racist country. So we did ethnic cleansing of the American Indians, we enslaved people, we had Jim Crow laws, we've had a whole series of really challenging, negative, racist behaviors on the one hand. On the other hand, we had some wonderfully enlightened behaviors where we had the American dream, and we had equality, and we had inclusion. And so we've been on two tracks, and the people who have benefited entirely from the positive track don't even know that the racism issues have been real and damaging to the people in the other track. So we've had a lack of understanding on that. And that lack of understanding right now is totally being shaken up by the riots and the feedback and the web and the cameras that everybody is carrying around. So we actually get to see that these murders that the police or that the Black community knew was happening were actually happening, and the white community had no clue. So what we have right now is, I think we're on the cusp potentially of huge progress on racism, because if we get this right, we can do the same things in racism that we have done on gender issues, move in the right direction and do some really good inclusive things. And it's entirely possible that convergence can play an important role in that process, helping people think it through, helping people get organized. There could be a convergence role on establishing what our new normal is on racism in this country.
What a wonderful and inspiring way to close the overall dialogue. I'm going to do a 3-minute wrap up so that we can end on time. First of all, I'll note that a few times the chat has included a link to our feedback survey. I hope everyone will take it, and if you're doing it while we're up, we'll keep including it. Whoever's posting that, can you keep posting it, since it keeps, at least for me, is falling below the line. Secondly, can everyone keep doing what has been started happening in chat, which is sharing one word or a quick phrase that you're feeling as we come to the close in terms of wrapping up and concluding this virtual Leadership Council meeting. Third, we're offering folks an opportunity, and we're asking for volunteers. We're creating 2 different opportunities for Leadership Council participants to continue to help us in between now and the next Leadership Council meeting. First, we're creating a review group, which will serve somewhere between like folks that are actually doing reviews and playing a focus group role. Or if you're willing to react, provide feedback and support for language and creative work that we're doing, so as we come up with the right ways to be making our case and talking about our programs and calling on America and calling on leaders to join us, we love the idea of including more people that are not sort of inside the churn of creating it to look at it. So please think of signing up for that. Please also think of signing up for another group, or pick one, don't do both. But the other group that we're asking for folks to sign up to is our Next Gen Leadership Council Working Group. Would some of you choose to help us think about how we evolve this Leadership Council so that it can become even more inclusive, can continue to engage you as you'd like to be engaged in a social distance world, and continue to grow and make the Leadership Council grow and become more impactful, just as we're looking for Convergence overall to grow and become more impactful. We'd be incredibly grateful. I have to share that I've been very moved by this meeting. It was very fast. I got an enormous amount out of it. Would love to hear each of your reflections about it. The board will be discussing this in our meeting tomorrow. We hope you are saving November 12th for our next Leadership Council meeting, and we will keep you posted as plans evolve in terms of, as most organizations, as they look toward November meetings, have a certain amount of uncertainty. Finally, Doozy, you did an amazing, amazing job. Thank you so much. And thanks to the entire Convergence team for this is always an all hands on deck moment. And this was my first, and it was quite impressive to watch. Finally, thanks for everyone for participating. Please again, click on the follow-up survey and let us know what you're thinking. And please make sure that you share a last word or phrase in the chat. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you.